Hello, everyone. This week we are going to explore sculpture and the place that it holds in Western arts. Recently, I visited the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. This is a very famous museum with a lot of European artworks, paintings, sculptures. And this particular sculpture spoke to me, and I wanted to share a quote by the creator, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. He said, "Sculpture is life, and life is movement. It's here, Paris, that you will learn how to render it. It's in the streets that we should study our art, not at the Vatican." This is an interesting quote. Even though we're not to this time period yet, you can see that this artist is referring to the cultural heritage that he comes from. The Vatican is the very important place in Rome with all the very important sculptures and frescoes of Michelangelo. And so he's saying that art should reflect life, real life, his lived experience. We are going to see throughout the history of sculpture and architecture that Greek classicism and Hellenism, and in general, the classical period and ancient Greco-Roman art tradition is very, very influential on later European artists from actually every genre. So you'll see in paintings, operas, poetry, literature, sculpture, that artists from different time periods, even time periods hundreds or thousands of years after the Greco-Roman time period, they're referring back to that time period. So that it's a very important cultural and artistic time period, and that's why we're starting there in our class. So if we look at, 2,000 actually this is 5,000 almost years of sculptural history, you can see on the far left of the slide, Cycladic, 2500 BCE. So this is from the islands, the Cyclades, which are the Greek islands. We can see ancient sculptures from this time period. And if we travel through the slide, we move to the 4th century BCE, the classical Greek period, all the way to the 20th century with this strange Giacometti and then reclining figure. It's actually interesting to see that I think the Cycladic example almost resembles the reclining figure from 2500, almost 5,000 years after its original creation. And so we're going to see a variety of representations of the human body, from symbolic in the terms of the Cycladic example, where you can see that, there's not attention to proportion, or realism. We don't, this doesn't depict a female figure the way the eye would see it, but it certainly depicts the important parts of the female form at this time period. The neck is elongated. Perhaps that was a symbol of beauty. We can see the pubic triangle representing the reproduction of the female form. So this isn't a representational depiction of a female body. Next to it, we can see an example from the classical Greek period, which we're going to be exploring this week in greater detail, but you can see that there's great attention to detail, to depicting the human form as the eye would see it, with attention to beauty and anatomy. And this classical Greek style was highly influential on later artists in Europe. You might ask yourself, and you should, if you see this Giacometti in a museum, and at the Art Institute of Chicago, there are several examples, why he depicted human beings like this. They almost look non-human, lifeless. Well, 1950 is post-World War II, and it was a very difficult time period. Perhaps Giacometti, as an artist, is not seeking to depict the ideal, like the classical Greek example, but seeking to depict another form of human experience. So ask yourself, of course, how can I apply sculptural vocabulary to what I'm seeing? But more importantly, what does this sculpture tell me about the time period from which it comes? What does it tell me about, how artists saw the world? Does it tell me anything about history? Is it related to important events that were going on? One of the oldest sculptures that we have is this figure called the Venus of Willendorf. And there were many small figures found in Europe. This was found in Willendorf, Germany, and it dates to around 25,000 BCE. There are older examples of cave paintings that date to around 30,000 years, 40,000 years, but there really isn't much art that has been found before that time period. So this figure is, famously found in textbooks as one of the oldest examples of sculpture. And obviously it idealizes in sort of a grotesque way, not to be, meaning exaggerated way, the important parts of the female body. The important parts that would represent, life and fertility. Her facial features are not depicted, and that's not important here. And if you had this object, you would notice that you could hold it in your hand. And the textured hair around the head could easily be rubbed with the thumb. And so we don't know what this woman, this figure was used for. We don't know who she is. We don't know if she was a goddess, but she definitely looks like something that was portable, that would have been maybe carried, in a hunter-gatherer society. Maybe, a man leaving the village would have carried this figure. We don't know. We can ask more questions than we have answers. But during this time period, there are a lot of figures that, archaeologists find and ask more questions than they can answer. So when we're looking at a sculpture, we want to ask questions, and we want to apply some of our sculptural terminology for formal analysis. Obviously, we've talked about the three different parts of visual analysis, meaning iconography, formal analysis, and contextual analysis. Iconography would be the study of the subject matter. In the case of the Venus of Willendorf, we don't really know much about her. Formal analysis means how the sculpture was made. And I want you guys to be able to apply some basic terms related to technique. Medium, sometimes the medium can feature different colors. Line, movement, size, shape, and proportion. So first of all, when we look at sculpture, there are two different ways that we can describe it, either as relief or in the round. Sculpture is related to architecture, as you saw this past week, in terms of the Parthenon, and often they go hand in hand. When sculpture is attached to a back of a building, for example, we call it relief. And when it's very large and sticks out from the back, almost like it's a standalone sculpture, we would call that high relief. Sculpture that is more closely attached to the background is considered low relief. So high and low reflect how much the images are protruding from the background material. In the round, as this Zeus of Artemision is a sculpture that we can walk around. He's three-dimensional. He's lifelike. We can see all sides of him. Lapith and Centaur on the left, which is one of the metopes on the Greek Parthenon, we can only see it from, I guess we could say we could see the front and the sides, but we can't see the back because it's attached to the back. Techniques refer to how the sculpture is made. Sculpture, obviously, a medium might be, I'm going to jump to the next slide, marble, metal, wood, clay, or other materials. And how that material is used, whether it's built up or subtracted, taken away, would describe an additive or subtractive technique. So an additive technique is a building technique. Perhaps we will use raw clay to build up a figurine. Bronze cast, which was the preferred medium in the classical Greek period, is an additive technique because a cast or a mold is created, and then liquid bronze, the metal, is used to fill and create the sculpture. So bronze is considered an additive technique. Most sculptural works are subtractive, meaning they are based on carving. Michelangelo got a huge block of marble and he started chipping away at it and carved the David, for example. There are other modern techniques in the 20th century that can get wild and crazy. We're not going to look at those right now. So the medium and method of production often go hand in hand. You'd want to talk about whether the medium is marble, which is a very soft, porous, and easy material to work with, which is why it's preferred, but it's also very easy to break, and that's why you'll see a lot of ancient sculptures in fragments. Bronze is very strong and durable, and some of the bronze figures that we have were either buried or found in the sea, which kind of preserved them. So the bronze figures from the ancient world are some of the best examples, but most of the examples we have from the ancient world are Roman copies. So what is the use for sculpture? Why does sculpture exist? Really, why does any art exist? And there are some practical purposes. There are some ideological purposes, institutional purposes like religion and politics. But maybe sculptures exist for fun and entertainment. Small figurines for portable or home use are very common. Sculptures like this standing Buddha, which is used for religious use, and sculpture is very important in Buddhist arts, mainly because of the importance of the Buddha and different representations of him and his life. So you would find that sculpture is really important in Buddhist arts. But the importance of sculpture around the world and in different cultures will vary. Some cultures may prefer painting as opposed to sculpture. Some may prefer sculpture out of wood. So we're obviously looking at the Western tradition, where bronze is very important and marble is also extremely important. Coins are considered kind of sculpture, and you can see all kinds of coins in museums from around the world that depict figures. And then this example of the bean, we might say that this is a kind of a civic purpose, and that it's entertainment or interaction, and that it beautifies the city of Chicago. It brings people together so that they can talk about it. You might say that it's entertainment or interaction. So Zeus of Artemision, we're going to look at him this week. He is in the round. He is bronze cast, that's the medium and technique, and this is an additive technique. So I can say 3 things about Zeus. If I were to add other things, I could talk about texture. Texture means the implied surface of the material. And I could say that Zeus clearly has a textured beard, which was the sign of wisdom in the ancient world, and textured hair, and that makes him more lifelike. I could also say that his body is very smooth, and that helps us see the anatomy that's strong and beautiful, and he represents a classical ideal. I could also talk about line and implied movement. Line refers to where your eye goes, how your eye moves around an image. When you're looking at a painting, the painter will, create images that direct your eye. You might not realize it, but your eye will move around. And our eye definitely moves from his elevated hand that seems to be holding something across his body to the other hand. And that length and that line gives him width and makes him seem very powerful. It also looks like there's implied movement because his feet seem to be almost in the middle of some movement. If we could see his facial expression, we could talk about that. So when you're looking at a sculpture, you want to try to apply some of this technical vocabulary as part of your formal analysis. So we have line, implied movement, texture, technique, medium, method of production. In the Roman period, we're going to see that just like the Greeks, Romans used sculpture to tell their stories. But in terms of stories, the Greeks told their stories of the gods in human form, but Romans told the stories of their emperors. And architecture and sculpture becomes political. So this is an important leader that we'll learn about in the next unit. And if you were to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, you will see that there's a lot of heads on pillars that you can walk around and look at. And the Romans really liked depicting their leaders and important figures in what we call portrait busts, which is like the top, maybe sometimes it has part of the torso, but really focuses on the face and capturing the character of the person in great detail. As I said, the Romans were interested in politics and propaganda and combined sculpture and architecture, as we'll see in future units. Sculpture can be used to tell stories. It can be used to further an ideology. And in this column of Trajan, we'll see how this very tall structure with very detailed relief, we can see this is relief sculpture. It's not extremely high, it's more low relief, tells the story of Trajan and his conquests to get money and build his empire. In the medieval period, which we're actually not going to cover in our class, sculpture is primarily used for religious use. We looked a little bit in the example of the book cover in the Lindau Gospels in the introduction to the course, but sculpture is used in places like book covers and architecture, and it's primarily religious as Christianity becomes the dominant religion throughout the medieval period. In the Renaissance period, we almost see like we're going back to ancient Greece, and sculpture becomes important, depicting not gods, but humans or characters from the Bible. Michelangelo and Donatello depict David, and we'll have a nice unit where we look at different representations of the David. And one is in bronze here, the medium, and one is in marble. The Renaissance sculptors loved to work in marble, and because they thought that was representative of the ancient world. But actually, the sculptures in the ancient world would have been very brightly painted. Or in the case of ancient Greece, they would have been done in bronze. As we get to the Baroque period, we'll see an element of theatricality come in. Again, as we move from something that looks more classical, balance, order, symmetry, to something that looks more emotional and Hellenistic, theatrical, light, dramatic facial expressions. We could talk about this piece, which is part of a chapel altar, and the piece has a lot of implied movement in the clothing and the garment, which appears to be flowing. And we can talk about the light that comes down on the sculpture. You know, in terms of light and color, usually that's reserved more for painting. But in this case, there's an architectural element of light shining down on the sculpture. In this example, we could talk about composition and line and how our eye moves kind of between Cupid's face and his arrow moving down towards Teresa. Again, moving kind of chronologically, I'm showing you different examples throughout time in the Western tradition. You might say to yourself, gosh, these all really remind me of classical sculpture, and you would be right in thinking that. In the 18th century, artists depicted images of important thinkers and political figures through sculpture, just as the Romans did. And they continue to reflect and use mythology as a subject matter. So you won't, even though these were done in the 18th century, they resemble greatly the examples from ancient Greece and Rome. Very famous example that's done in a natural environment on a huge scale that's also very political. Rodin. And I just visited the, Rodin Museum in Paris, and I'll be excited to share some of the videos that I have. Rodin is like one of the first modern artists, 1900, think the beginning of modernity, the beginning of the modern time. And his sculptures have this rawness to them and this weight that I think is reflective of the time period of, the Industrial Revolution and the development of the modern city, and man sort of like struggling as he finds his identity in this new modern life, modern city. As we get into the modern period, you guys are probably all familiar with this Picasso example that's in Chicago. We can see that artists like completely reject and abandon everything that artists have done up until this time period. And artists look for new ways to create sculptures using new techniques that are available, use of metal, and move away from representation towards abstraction. Minimalism is also a movement that some people absolutely hate because they ask themselves, why is this art? I totally get it, you guys. But minimalism is a movement where artists strip everything down to their most basic elements. Appropriation is another term that we talk about in terms of sculpture, where artists create massive sculptural works that look like simple, silly, stupid objects from everyday life. And in this example of Balloon Dog, we can see that this elaborate, very, this is a huge, huge piece, resembles something that is just so simple. And you guys can interpret that and talk about it the way you want. Appropriation would be using a very simple, mundane object from everyday life and turning it into something gigantic and artistic. Post-minimalism, kind of, this is, this is our contemporary period. Cloudgate in Chicago is a great example, and also an example of installation, which is another word that we use in terms of sculpture, because sculpture can be placed permanently or temporarily in a location. So sometimes you'll see a sculptural installation at the Art Institute of Chicago that's temporary, and the artist puts it up and then takes it down and moves it somewhere else. In the case of Cloudgate, or the Bean, as you guys probably know it, Anish Kapoor has pretty much permanently installed this piece there, and it's become an important part of our city identity. And we can talk about what it means. We could talk about the use of the material and that it reflects the sky. It sort of connects the city skyline to the sky, the buildings, the skyline, to the sky beyond. It is constantly changing because the day is changing, the clouds are changing, the people that are standing in front of it are changing. And so it's a reflection of the city, its people, its buildings, its light, its weather. It brings people together. It's very abstractly, reflects a shape of a gate, which typically a gate in a city, like the Propylaea, the gate to the Acropolis, is a post and lintel and more geometrical. But this one is more abstract. It looks like a bean, but it does represent what we traditionally see in cities as a gate. So again, when you're looking at examples of sculpture, you want to talk about the artist. If the artist is known, always include the title in italics, the date or approximate date that it was created. Reflect on the medium and whether it was done with a subtractive or additive technique. If the medium contributes to the meaning of the piece or its interpretation, or its aesthetic beauty, or its power. You can talk about the size and the location of it. Think about its purpose and cultural meaning. How does sculpture reflect what's going on in the world and the values of the time period that you learn about through our textbook? I'm here if you have any questions. Have fun exploring sculpture.